The lake cabin had always been my place of solitude, a retreat tucked away at the edge of the water where pine trees leaned over the shoreline and the air smelled of damp earth and fresh mountain winds. I had purchased it years ago as a way to escape from the constant noise of suburban neighborhoods and the grinding disputes of homeowners associations. Ironically, it was that very world of HOA battles that had pulled me back into the spotlight, and on this particular weekend, the quiet sanctuary was about to become the stage for a confrontation that no one could have scripted. The morning had started with a crisp serenity. Mist hovered low over the water, curling in soft ribbons across the glassy surface of the lake. Inside, I prepared fresh coffee while stacking folders and documents neatly across the cabin's wooden table. The reason for my preparation was significant. I was scheduled to meet with a U.S. district judge later that afternoon, a man who had agreed to review a series of alarming HOA complaints that had spiraled beyond ordinary community disagreements. This was no ordinary conversation. The evidence gathered suggested corruption, intimidation, and possible violations of federal housing laws. It was the kind of matter that could collapse an entire HOA board if proven true. I had invited the judge to meet here, away from the distractions of city offices and endless interruptions. The lake cabin provided privacy, a sense of safety, and the opportunity for us to speak without fear of unwanted ears listening in. The folders on the table contained testimony from residents, copies of suspicious financial records, and even photos that suggested the misuse of community funds. At the center of it all was the HOA president herself, the woman neighbors had come to call Karen. Her reputation was legendary in the worst possible way. She had fined residents for leaving garden hoses coiled incorrectly, demanded the removal of porch swings deemed aesthetic violations, and even tried to dictate the hours when children could play outdoors. Yet beneath her petty rules was something darker. Money had gone missing. Budgets had been altered, and contracts had been awarded to companies owned by her relatives. What began as whispers had now grown into a storm, and the storm was about to crash against my cabin door. As I organized the documents, I allowed myself to glance out the wide windows that overlooked the lake. The sunlight had begun to pierce the mist, turning the surface into a shimmer of gold. The quiet should have been calming, but my instincts told me the day would not remain peaceful. Whenever power is challenged, those who cling to it rarely sit idly by. By noon, I had finished preparing notes, marking key points for discussion with the judge. I reheated the coffee, checked the lock on the front door, and placed the folders in chronological order. The sound of gravel crunching beneath. Tires caught my attention, and I stepped to the porch, expecting to see the judge's vehicle arriving early. Instead, a different car appeared. It was the kind of glossy SUV often seen in suburban driveways, freshly washed, with vanity plates that screamed self-importance. My stomach tightened. Even before the driver's door opened, I knew. There she was, Karen herself, stepping out with the energy of someone who believed every place she entered automatically belonged to her authority. Dressed in a tailored jacket far too formal for a lakeside afternoon, she clutched a folder of her own under her arm, her expression twisted into righteous indignation. The audacity of her presence was staggering. She had no invitation, no permission, and certainly no right to be here. Yet Karen operated under the belief that rules were for others, never for her. She marched across the gravel driveway and up the wooden steps of the porch as though storming a stage prepared for her performance. Without even pausing to knock, she pushed the cabin door open and stepped inside. The scent of pine and coffee did nothing to soften the tension. Her eyes darted immediately to the documents spread across the table. For a brief moment, her lips tightened into a line that betrayed recognition and fear. She knew exactly what those papers meant, but instead of retreating, she advanced further, slamming her folder down onto the table with a sharp crack that echoed against the wooden walls. The cabin, once filled with the quiet murmur of the lake, now vibrated with confrontation. I remained still, steadying my breath, unwilling to let her theatrics unbalance me. This was not the time for arguments. Not yet. The judge would arrive soon, and her presence here could either expose her desperation or fuel her accusations. She paced, her heels striking the wood in quick, agitated rhythms. She muttered about betrayal, about residents turning against her, about outsiders meddling in what she called community affairs. Every word was coated with the tone of someone convinced of her own superiority, someone incapable of seeing the line between authority and abuse. I watched silently, documenting her behavior in memory. Her intrusion itself was evidence, trespassing into private property, attempting to interfere with a federal discussion. Yet what unsettled me most was not her presence but her timing. How had she known the meeting would be here? Had someone informed her? Or had she been following me, waiting for the opportunity to assert herself before the judge could even hear the evidence? Minutes passed like hours. The weight of the confrontation pressed against the walls of the cabin. Karen finally turned, her finger stabbing the air toward the documents as though the gesture alone could erase them. Her face reddened, veins tightening along her neck, her voice rising into sharp, cutting tones. Though I said nothing, her words filled the room like a storm, swelling against fragile windows. Then, as abruptly as she had arrived, a sound broke through, the distant approach of another vehicle. The deep growl of tires along gravel grew louder, closer, until it pulled into view outside the cabin. This was no suburban SUV. It was the car of the U.S. District Judge, a figure who carried with him not just authority, but the weight of the law itself. Karen froze. For the first time, her confidence faltered. She glanced from me to the door, her breathing quickening, her eyes flickering with the calculation of someone suddenly caught in the wrong place at the worst possible time. The judge's arrival had transformed her intrusion from a show of dominance into a revelation of guilt. I stepped aside, allowing the judge to enter. He paused only briefly at the sight of Karen standing inside the cabin, uninvited and visibly agitated. His eyes narrowed, assessing the situation instantly. What was meant to be a quiet, controlled meeting had now escalated into a scene of unplanned confrontation. The air carried the tension of a trial about to begin, except this courtroom had walls of pine and windows overlooking a lake. The moment was pivotal. Karen had stormed in believing she could control the narrative, but instead, she had placed herself in the very center of the story she wished to suppress. The judge set his briefcase on the table, his calm authority contrasting sharply with her restless energy. And so, the stage was set. The evidence lay waiting, the judge prepared to listen, and the self-proclaimed ruler of the neighborhood found herself cornered in a place she never should have entered. What followed would shape not only the future of the HOA, but the fate of everyone who had lived under her reign of control. The cabin, once my sanctuary, had become the arena. The storm had arrived, and it was only the beginning. The cabin, normally a refuge of stillness, now carried an electric charge that vibrated through every timber beam and pane of glass. The U.S. District Judge had arrived with the steady presence of someone accustomed to volatile situations, but even he seemed faintly surprised to find the HOA president already inside. Karen stood frozen near the table, her body angled defensively, one hand clinging to the folder she had slammed down only minutes before. The expression on her face wavered between outrage and panic, as though she were still calculating whether to fight or flee. The judge removed his coat with deliberate calm, placing it neatly across the back of a chair. His movements were slow, measured, and unshakable, an unspoken signal that he would not be rushed or rattled by theatrics. He set his briefcase on the table, unlatched it with a click, and drew out a series of files bound in neat stacks. The rustle of paper and the metallic snap of the briefcase hinges filled the silence, emphasizing the gravity of his role. Karen attempted to speak first, her voice pitching higher than usual, brittle with forced confidence. She claimed the meeting was unnecessary, that residents had exaggerated their complaints, that outside interference would only complicate matters. Her words spilled quickly, overlapping themselves, a defensive wall built from noise rather than substance. Yet the judge simply looked at her without interruption, his eyes steady, his posture immovable. It was the kind of silence that dismantles arguments without needing a single rebuttal. When she realized her voice was failing to command the room, Karen shifted tactics. She accused me of betrayal, of conspiring against her authority, of fabricating grievances to stir chaos. She leaned into the role of victim, painting herself as the misunderstood leader burdened with responsibility. But her gestures betrayed her, the clenched fists, the reddened face, the darting eyes that avoided the documents stacked in front of her. The judge finally spoke, his tone even and composed, carrying the weight of authority honed over decades. He acknowledged her presence, but reminded her firmly that she had not been invited to this meeting. The words landed with the impact of a gavel striking hardwood. Karen flinched, momentarily silenced, though her lips still quivered as if desperate to resume her protest. He then turned his attention to the evidence on the table, carefully reviewing the sequence of documents I had prepared. Every page told a story of excess, misuse, and arrogance. Financial spreadsheets revealed missing funds allocated to maintenance projects that had never been completed. Emails showed threats directed at residents who dared question the board. Testimonies described late-night confrontations, petty fines, and harassment so relentless that some families had moved away entirely. Karen shifted uneasily as the judge examined the records. Her posture, once rigid with defiance, began to sag as though the weight of the papers themselves pressed her downward. She attempted interruptions, weak deflections, but each time the judge's calm voice cut through, reminding her that she would have the opportunity to respond after the review. He would not allow chaos in this room. Outside the cabin, the lake shimmered with the first hints of afternoon sunlight. The serenity of the scene clashed with the storm inside, a reminder that truth often collides with power in the most unlikely settings. The occasional call of a bird carried faintly through the window, but within these walls, the only sounds were the turn of pages and Karen's uneven breathing. As the review continued, the judge began to ask pointed questions. Where had the missing funds been allocated? Why were contracts awarded without bids? Why were violations selectively enforced against specific families while others were ignored? Each question was a chisel strike against the fragile wall of excuses Karen had erected. Her answers stumbled, tangled in contradictions, revealing the cracks widening beneath her authority. I remained silent, allowing the process to unfold. This was no longer my battle alone. It had become an official inquiry, overseen by a figure who carried both the wisdom of the law and the patience to uncover truth. Karen's dominance, once unquestioned in neighborhood meetings, now dissolved, under the steady gaze of someone she could neither intimidate nor silence. The judge paused, closing one of the folders, and leaned back slightly in his chair. He observed Karen with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting out storms, then spoke with quiet firmness. He informed her that the evidence presented was serious enough to warrant federal review. Misuse of HOA funds, if proven, could escalate into charges of fraud. Harassment of residents could be considered civil rights violations. The words fell heavily into the room, transforming the atmosphere from tense confrontation to imminent reckoning. Karen's face drained of color. She attempted one last surge of indignation, insisting that all accusations were fabricated, that she had acted in the best interest of the community. But the judge's expression did not change. His authority was unshaken, his focus absolute. For the first time, Karen seemed to grasp the enormity of her situation. This was no longer about controlling a neighborhood board. This was about the possibility of facing consequences far beyond petty fines and angry homeowners. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the old wooden clock mounted on the cabin wall. Each second echoed like a countdown to the inevitable. Karen gathered her folder abruptly, clutching it to her chest, as though it could shield her from the truth pressing in from all sides. She muttered about needing to consult her own records, about unfair targeting, about residents who had misunderstood her intentions. Her words lacked conviction now, sounding more like the retreating steps of someone who had lost the ground beneath them. The judge remained composed, making clear that this matter would not be buried, not here and not anywhere. He reminded her that attempts to interfere with an official inquiry could only worsen her standing. Karen's response faltered into silence, her body angled toward the door as if the urge to flee was overtaking her will to argue. At last, she turned sharply, storming out of the cabin with the same force she had entered. The slam of the door echoed against the walls, rattling the windows slightly before the stillness returned. The sound of her SUV starting outside carried through the trees, followed by the crunch of tires retreating down the gravel road. The judge exhaled slowly, closing the final folder with deliberate calm. The storm had passed for the moment, but its echoes remained heavy in the room. He turned toward me, his eyes thoughtful, and remarked that what we had witnessed was more than defiance. It was fear. Fear of exposure, fear of accountability, fear of losing control. The lake outside glimmered brighter now, but the battle had only begun. Karen's retreat was not the end. It was the start of something larger, a fight that would extend beyond these cabin walls. The documents on the table were no longer just evidence. They were the seeds of a case that could unravel everything she had built. The judge leaned forward once more, his voice steady, reminding me that storms rarely end with the first thunderclap. This was only the second chapter of a conflict destined to grow far louder before silence could finally return. When Karen's SUV disappeared down the gravel road, the air in the cabin finally began to settle. The judge and I sat in the silence that followed, both of us aware that the confrontation we had just witnessed was only the beginning of a much larger battle. Outside, the lake rippled gently, as if nothing had happened. But I knew the ripples in our community would soon spread far wider than the water's surface. The judge reviewed his notes, meticulously placing markers on certain documents. His calm demeanor suggested control, yet I could see the weight of responsibility resting in the crease of his brow. He explained that federal involvement was not a matter to be taken lightly, but the evidence demanded serious consideration. Fraud, harassment, and abuse of power, each accusation carried consequences that could dismantle not just Karen's position, but the entire structure of her HOA board. I offered him coffee, and for a moment, the cabin returned to its role as a place of quiet discussion. Yet beneath that surface, both of us understood that the confrontation had triggered something unstoppable. Karen would not retreat quietly. Her pattern had always been escalation. When challenged, she fought harder, louder and dirtier. Now that she had witnessed firsthand the weight of federal authority aligned against her, she would double her efforts to manipulate the narrative. By evening, the judge departed, leaving me with instructions to secure the documents and prepare for potential testimonies from residents. His car disappeared into the distance, its taillights fading into the dusk. Alone once more, I sat by the window, watching the last sliver of sunlight sink behind the mountains. The lake reflected the fire of the sunset, a mirror of beauty against the storm that was gathering beyond the trees. The following morning, whispers began. It started with phone calls from neighbors, voices heavy with urgency. Some had already heard from Karen herself. She had wasted no time spinning the story, presenting her intrusion into the cabin as an act of defense against what she called a smear campaign. According to her, the judge's presence had been nothing more than a routine visit, exaggerated by troublemakers eager to see her fail. Her version twisted facts into accusations against me, painting me as a manipulator, an instigator seeking to undermine the harmony of the community. I listened quietly as each neighbor relayed their encounters with her. The pattern was unmistakable. She was working quickly to poison the well before truth could take root. Her strategy relied on fear, convincing residents that siding against her would bring retaliation, while portraying herself as the only force capable of protecting property values and order. But even as she spread her story, cracks in her control began to widen. Some residents, emboldened by the knowledge that federal eyes were now upon her, began to push back. They shared their own experiences openly, no longer whispering in fear of retribution. Stories of arbitrary fines, intimidation, at board meetings and selective enforcement surfaced with increasing volume. The narrative was shifting, and Karen's grip on authority was slipping faster than she could repair it. One evening, as I returned to the cabin after a walk along the lake, I found a small envelope tucked beneath the door. Inside were handwritten notes from several neighbors, each one thanking me for standing up to Karen. They confessed their relief that someone was finally challenging her reign, and they expressed hope that justice might actually be possible. Their words carried both gratitude and desperation, revealing just how deeply her control had penetrated daily life in the neighborhood. Yet for every note of support, there were also signs of resistance. Anonymous letters arrived, warning me to stay out of HOA matters, claiming that interference would only bring trouble. The language was sharp, the tone threatening, though unsigned. I recognized the tactic immediately: intimidation cloaked in anonymity, a hallmark of those who feared exposure but still sought to silence dissent. Whether the letters came directly from Karen or from her loyal supporters was unclear, but the intent was unmistakable. The cabin became both refuge and outpost. Documents were stacked neatly in secure boxes, evidence that represented not just my efforts, but the voices of countless residents. Each page was a shield against manipulation, each testimony a crack in the facade Karen had built. The weight of responsibility pressed heavier with each passing day, yet I reminded myself that this was not about one individual's vendetta. It was about protecting an entire community from the tyranny of unchecked power. Word reached me that Karen had convened a private meeting with her closest allies. Reports suggested she was rallying them, urging loyalty, warning them of the chaos that would ensue if she were removed. She claimed property values would plummet, that outsiders would exploit the neighborhood, that families would regret turning against her. Her fear-mongering was desperate, but desperation can be dangerous. Those who have ruled unchecked for too long often lash out most violently when their control is threatened. Despite her efforts, a shift was undeniable. Residents who once avoided eye contact at community gatherings now began speaking openly, their courage growing as they realized they were not alone. The judge's presence at the cabin had not only introduced accountability, but had also lit a spark of resistance that could not be extinguished by intimidation alone. Still, I knew the fight was far from over. Karen had influence, resources, and a willingness to manipulate. She had already stormed into my private space once. There was no telling what boundaries she would cross next. The coming weeks would test not just the strength of evidence, but the resilience of every person willing to oppose her. Late at night, I sat by the cabin's fireplace, the crackle of flames echoing the turmoil in my mind. The notes from supportive neighbors lay beside me, small reminders that truth had allies even in the face of fear. Yet I could not ignore the tension that lingered like smoke. Karen was plotting, preparing, and waiting for her next move. The calm between storms is always deceptive, and this calm carried the weight of inevitability. As the fire dimmed and shadows stretched across the cabin walls, I realized the neighborhood was no longer simply a community divided by disputes over rules. It had become a battlefield of narratives, truth clashing against deception, residents caught between fear and hope. The storm was growing, and the echoes of Karen's intrusion into my cabin were only the first thunderclap. The judge had been right. Storms do not end with the first clash. They build, they swell, and they consume everything in their path until truth or ruin remains. I braced myself for what was coming, knowing Karen would not surrender quietly. She had shown her hand, and now the game was set. The whispers had begun, and soon they would rise into a chorus loud enough to shake the very foundation of her authority. The days following the judge's visit became a blur of shifting alliances and growing tension. The neighborhood, once a quiet cluster of families living under the shadow of Karen's authority, now vibrated with unease. Whispers had turned into open conversations, and open conversations were beginning to form into action. Yet with each step forward, Karen escalated her tactics, determined to reassert her dominance no matter the cost. One morning I woke to find a notice pinned to the cabin door. It bore the HOA's letterhead, stamped aggressively in red ink. According to the document, I had violated community standards by harboring unauthorized activity within the property. The language was vague, intentionally crafted to sound legal without actually citing any enforceable rule. It was her signature move, weaponizing paperwork as a tool of intimidation. The irony was striking. This was my cabin, located outside, the very HOA she presided over. Yet in her desperation, she had extended her reach beyond her jurisdiction, grasping at any method to reassert control. I contacted the judge immediately, forwarding him a copy of the notice. His response was calm but firm. He reassured me that the act itself only added to the growing evidence of her abuse of power. Each overreach, each attempt to intimidate, was another stone stacked against her in the foundation of a case that was building momentum. Still, the encounter left me uneasy. If she was willing to cross boundaries so boldly, what would her next move be? The answer came sooner than I expected. Residents began reporting sudden increases in fines for trivial matters: grass cut half an inch too high, trash bins left at the curb for minutes longer than scheduled, decorative wreaths deemed unapproved. The pattern was unmistakable. Karen was lashing out, punishing anyone suspected of siding against her. The fines were not about enforcement, they were about fear, a reminder that she still held the power to disrupt daily lives. Yet instead of breaking the community, her aggression only hardened their resolve. Neighbors began gathering informally, meeting in living rooms and backyards to share stories and compare notes. They created lists of violations that had been unfairly issued, pooling evidence that mirrored the documents already secured in my cabin. For the first time, residents who had once bowed quietly to her authority began standing shoulder to shoulder, united by a common determination. Karen, however, was not blind to the shift. Her tone at board meetings grew sharper, her accusations louder. She claimed conspiracies were forming, that outsiders were poisoning the harmony of the neighborhood. Her loyalists echoed her rhetoric, repeating the narrative that without her control, the community would collapse into chaos. It was a fragile illusion, but illusions are powerful when fear clings to them. One evening, as I sat at the cabin sorting through the growing mountain of documents, headlights swept across the windows. I stepped onto the porch, expecting a visitor. Instead, I saw a vehicle idling at the edge of the driveway, its engine humming in the stillness of the night. The silhouette of a driver lingered behind the windshield, unmoving, watching. After several minutes, the car reversed slowly, disappearing, back down the gravel road. The message was clear. Intimidation was no longer confined to paper. It had taken a physical form. I reported the incident, and the judge advised additional precautions. He reminded me that fear was a weapon often wielded by those who sensed their control slipping away. The cabin, once a retreat, now felt like the front line of a conflict escalating beyond mere disputes over neighborhood aesthetics. Despite the tension, there were moments of unexpected strength. Families who had once avoided confrontation now began speaking directly to one another about their experiences. Stories that had been suppressed for years poured out, accounts of harassment, bullying, and manipulation. One couple revealed they had considered selling their home simply to escape the suffocating control. Another described how their children were scolded for playing too loudly in their own backyard. Each testimony added to the growing chorus of voices demanding change. Karen responded by doubling down. She circulated newsletters dripping with propaganda, portraying herself as the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by malcontents. She painted the federal inquiry as overreach, insisting it was nothing more than a witch hunt designed to dismantle community values. Her words attempted to cloak her in righteousness, but beneath the surface, the cracks widened. Even some of her longtime supporters began questioning whether loyalty to her was worth the mounting chaos. The breaking point arrived at a community gathering scheduled under the guise of a neighborhood update. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a building funded by resident fees, yet long controlled by Karen and her board. The room filled with anxious faces, the air heavy with anticipation. She stood at the podium, her posture stiff, her voice sharp as she declared herself the guardian of order. She railed against conspiracies, naming no one specifically, but casting shadows wide enough to touch everyone present. But then a resident stood. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of years of suppressed frustration. He asked pointedly where the missing funds had gone, why maintenance projects remained incomplete despite budget allocations, why selective enforcement was tolerated. The room shifted. Others began adding their voices, their questions overlapping, their tone firm. Karen attempted to shout over them, but the tide had turned. The illusion of control fractured in real time. I remained at the back, observing. The scene unfolded like a dam breaking, years of pressure finally surging forward. Karen's words, once weapons, now sounded desperate, hollow. The residents she had ruled through fear were no longer cowering. They were rising. The meeting ended in chaos, her authority shredded by the very people she had sought to control. She stormed from the clubhouse, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her folder of notes. The once unquestioned leader now appeared cornered, fragile against the storm she had created. That night, as I sat once more in the cabin, I reflected on what had transpired. Karen had escalated, but her escalation had backfired. Her grip on the neighborhood was slipping through her fingers, and though she would not surrender easily, the tide had shifted irreversibly. The storm was no longer looming. It was here, tearing through the facade of power she had built. The judge had warned that storms rarely end with their first clash. He was right. This storm was growing, consuming everything in its path, and Karen was standing directly in the center of it. The community meeting had marked a turning point. For the first time, Karen's authority had been publicly challenged, and her facade of control cracked in front of the very people she had ruled for years. Yet if anyone expected her to retreat, quietly, they underestimated her capacity for defiance. Karen was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. She was the type to dig her heels deeper, clawing at any thread of power still within her grasp. The following week, her retaliation began. Overnight, several residents who had spoken against her at the meeting received violation notices. The charges were absurd. Mailboxes painted with unapproved shades, vehicles parked too close to the curb, and holiday decorations displayed outside of designated hours. It was Karen's way of reminding everyone that even when her authority wavered, she could still make lives miserable. But this time, the intimidation failed to achieve its purpose. Instead of backing down, the residents banded together. Copies of the violation notices circulated among households, posted discreetly on community bulletin boards, and shared digitally in group chats. The absurdity of the charges became evidence. of her desperation, and the solidarity among neighbors grew stronger. Her weapon of fear had lost its edge. Meanwhile, the judge's investigation advanced quietly but steadily. He requested additional testimonies, financial records, and communication logs from residents willing to step forward. The pile of evidence stacked higher with each passing day, filling storage boxes that lined the walls of my cabin. Each document told a story, each testimony revealed another layer of her misuse of power. Together, they painted a damning portrait of a leader who had mistaken fear for loyalty and control for governance. Late one evening, as I sorted through documents by lamplight, a knock at the cabin door startled me. Opening it cautiously, I found two residents standing nervously, glancing over their shoulders as though afraid of being followed. They carried with them envelopes filled with copies of emails, correspondence from Karen that revealed her attempts to manipulate board votes and silence dissent. The residents confessed they had been too afraid to share these before, fearing retaliation. But after witnessing the community's shift, they no longer wanted to remain silent. Their courage symbolized the transformation taking root in the neighborhood. Karen's grip had been strongest when residents felt isolated, each family believing they bore her wrath alone. Now that illusion had collapsed. They were no longer scattered voices. They were a chorus, unified by shared suffering and the hope of justice. Still, Karen was far from defeated. Reports circulated that she had hired an attorney, one known for aggressive tactics and public theatrics. Rumors spread that she intended to sue residents for defamation, a threat designed to intimidate them back into silence. Whether her legal standing held weight was irrelevant. The fear of expensive court battles loomed heavily over families already drained by years of fines and harassment. The judge anticipated her moves. He cautioned residents not to panic, reminding them that truth was a stronger defense than intimidation. He assured them that retaliatory lawsuits could be challenged and dismissed if they lacked merit. His steady voice became an anchor, a reminder that the storm, though fierce, was navigable. Karen's attorney soon made his presence known. Letters began arriving in mailboxes, filled with legal jargon and threats of litigation. They accused residents of slander, demanded retractions of statements, and warned of financial consequences. But unlike before, when such tactics might have scattered the community, the residents responded with resilience. They consulted with their own legal counsel, coordinated their defenses, and continued cooperating with the judge's inquiry. What once might have broken them now bound them tighter. As tensions escalated, I noticed changes in Karen herself. The woman who once stormed into rooms with unwavering confidence now appeared strained. Her once sharp attire looked hastily arranged. Her speeches carried the frantic edge of someone fighting against inevitability. The cracks in her armor widened, visible to anyone paying attention. Even her most loyal supporters began whispering. Doubts, their loyalty tested by the mounting chaos she had unleashed. The climax came one night when I received a frantic call from a neighbor. Karen had attempted to hold an emergency board meeting, declaring that drastic measures were necessary to restore order. But the turnout had been sparse. Many residents simply refused to attend, tired of her theatrics. Those who did arrive reported that she ranted for nearly an hour, pointing fingers, issuing threats, and accusing unnamed conspirators of orchestrating her downfall. The meeting ended abruptly when several board members walked out, leaving her shouting to a half-empty room. It was clear her reign was crumbling, but I knew better than to believe she would surrender without a final strike. Desperate leaders rarely fade quietly. They thrash, they claw, they grasp at any shred of power left. And Karen was nothing if not desperate. That night, as I sat on the cabin porch staring across the darkened lake, I felt the weight of anticipation pressing down. Like the heavy air before a storm, the moon reflected off the water, silver ripples stretching across the surface. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the night. Yet my thoughts lingered on Karen, on the inevitable clash that was still to come. The judge's words echoed. In my mind, storms grow louder before they end. This storm was nearing its peak, and I could feel the air trembling with its coming fury. Karen had lost control of the narrative, lost the confidence of her community, and soon she would lose the protection of her position. But in her final moments of power, she would lash out with everything she had left. The evidence was ready, the residents were united, and the cracks in her armor were spreading too wide to conceal. The end was near, but like all storms, the final surge would be the most violent of all. The storm arrived on a gray morning, fittingly grim and heavy with the promise of confrontation. For weeks, the tension had built like the swelling of clouds over the lake, and now it was about to break. The federal judge had scheduled a decisive hearing, summoning the HOA board, Karen, and several key residents to present their sides. Though the proceedings were not a full trial, the outcome would determine the fate of the HOA's leadership and set the course for the community's future. Karen arrived first, striding toward the courthouse steps with forced confidence. She wore her trademark red blazer, though it hung awkwardly on her shoulders now, the posture beneath no longer commanding, but brittle. Her attorney flanked her, carrying a briefcase stuffed with folders, his expression sharp but uneasy. Behind them, a small handful of her remaining loyalists shuffled along, their faces drawn with fatigue and doubt. On the opposite side, residents gathered quietly. They carried binders filled with documents, photos, and records painstakingly collected over months. Some had lost sleep preparing their statements, others had rehearsed their words with trembling determination, yet standing together, their fear seemed to fade, replaced by solidarity. For the first time, they no longer felt like scattered individuals facing an unmovable force. They were a united front. The judge presided with the same calm authority he had shown throughout the ordeal. His presence filled the chamber, not with intimidation, but with reassurance that order and fairness would prevail. He began by outlining the purpose of the hearing: to evaluate the conduct of the HOA leadership, review the evidence of mismanagement, and determine corrective actions. Karen's attorney launched into his defense first. He painted Karen as a misunderstood leader, burdened with the thankless task of enforcing rules in a difficult community. He dismissed the residents' complaints as exaggerated, claimed violations were standard practice, and argued that the backlash against her was nothing more than a personal vendetta led by a few disgruntled homeowners. His words echoed in the chamber, polished and deliberate, but behind the veneer was a hollowness, an argument stretched thin against the weight of reality. When it was Karen's turn to speak, the room stiffened. She rose with her usual dramatics, her voice sharp and heavy with indignation. She accused the residents of betrayal, painted herself as a victim of conspiracy, and even suggested that the judge himself was biased due to his presence in the cabin meeting weeks prior. Her words grew shrill, her composure slipping with every sentence. What was meant to be a defense unraveled into a tirade, her desperation spilling into the open for all to see. Then came the residents. One by one, they stood and told their stories. A retired couple spoke of the years they spent paying fines for trivial matters while struggling to maintain their home. A young family described the harassment they endured after questioning board decisions. Others presented records of arbitrary fees, altered meeting minutes, and threats disguised as official notices. Their voices were steady, not vengeful, but resolute, each testimony adding weight to the growing mountain of evidence. I presented last. Carrying the thick binder of collected documents, I placed it before the judge and summarized the journey we had all endured. From Karen storming into my cabin on the lake to the collective courage that finally broke her reign of fear. I emphasized that this was not about vengeance, but about accountability, about restoring trust where it had been shattered. The room was silent as I finished, the weight of the moment pressing against every corner of the chamber. The judge took his time. He reviewed the evidence, asked clarifying questions, and allowed both sides to respond. Hours passed, the air heavy with anticipation. Finally, he delivered his decision. Karen was to be removed from her position as HOA president effective immediately. The board would undergo restructuring, with temporary oversight assigned until new elections could be fairly conducted. Financial audits would be carried out, with restitution considered for residents unlawfully fined. Furthermore, the judge recommended that any retaliatory lawsuits pursued by Karen or her attorney be dismissed as baseless intimidation. The words fell like thunder across the chamber. Relief swept through the residents, a collective exhale of breath held for far too long. Some wept quietly, others exchanged embraces, and many simply stood still, letting the reality sink in. After years of enduring her dominance, the tide had finally turned. Karen, however, erupted. She shouted protests, slammed her hands on the table, and declared the proceedings illegitimate. Her attorney tried to calm her, but she tore free, railing against the judge, the residents, and anyone within reach of her fury. Security was called to escort her out, her red blazer flashing like a warning signal as she disappeared down the hall, her voice echoing until it was muffled by the closing doors. Silence lingered in her absence. It was the silence of closure, of a storm finally passing. The judge adjourned the session with a few firm words about accountability and the resilience of communities when they chose unity over fear. Then, with a gavel's final strike, the ordeal that had consumed so many lives officially ended. Outside, the residents gathered on the courthouse steps. The clouds had parted, sunlight breaking through to reflect on their faces. Conversations rose, some about next steps, others about long-forgotten neighborly bonds they were eager to restore. Children played on the lawn, laughter ringing out, as though reclaiming the space from the heaviness of the day. I stood quietly at the edge, watching. My role had been unexpected, thrust upon me by circumstance, but I felt no regret. The lake cabin had become more than a retreat. It had been the meeting ground for change, the place where courage took root. As I looked at the faces around me, I knew the community was stronger now than it had ever been. Karen would fade, her influence reduced to whispers of warning, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is abused. But the residents would endure. They had weathered the storm together, and in doing so, discovered the strength that fear had long concealed. That evening, back at the cabin, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting, the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The lake rippled gently, the world calm once more. I thought of the journey, the conflict, the defiance, the unity, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. Justice had not come easily, but it had come. A storm had broken, the armor had shattered, and in its place stood a community reborn, free at last from the shadow of Karen's reign.